Long before the conveniences of modern medicine and technology, the people of ancient Egypt were remarkable innovators, weaving practicality and spirituality into every aspect of their lives, from the majestic pyramids to the intricate rituals surrounding health and sexuality. Among the lesser-known but fascinating facets of their ingenuity was their understanding of protection during intimacy, which included the use of early forms of condoms. Though it might sound surprising to many today, archaeological findings and ancient texts suggest that Egyptians crafted protective sheaths from animal intestines and the skins of bulls. These were not simple novelties. They were practical tools used to prevent the spread of disease and control reproduction, reflecting a deep knowledge of anatomy and the delicate balance between pleasure, health, and spirituality. Imagine the city of Thebes, thousands of years ago, a vibrant metropolis along the Nile, alive with traders, priests, craftsmen, and royalty. The great temples echoed with chants, and the air was perfumed with incense and lotus blossoms. Yet beneath the grandeur lay the everyday realities of life, including the challenges of sexual health and fertility. The crafting of these early condoms was an art in itself. Tanners selected the finest animal hides. Bull's skin was prized for its strength and flexibility. Through meticulous preparation, the skins were cleaned, stretched, and thinned to create a durable yet supple material. The resulting sheath was a carefully designed barrier, likely lubricated with natural oils or resins from plants to ensure comfort and effectiveness. Within the royal courts, including perhaps that of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, such devices held particular significance. Beyond mere physical protection, they were woven into the complex tapestry of religious beliefs and social customs. Ancient Egyptians believed that purity, both spiritual and physical, was essential to maintaining order and harmony, known as ma'at. The use of protective coverings during intercourse could serve as a safeguard not only against disease, but also to preserve ritual cleanliness, especially for priests and members of the elite. The importance of family lineage and the control of fertility further underscored the role of such devices. Royal families were acutely aware of the need to ensure legitimate heirs, and managing reproduction was critical in a society where bloodlines determined power and divine right. Thus, condoms might have been used selectively to regulate these delicate matters. Historical documents, such as the Ebers Papyrus, an ancient medical text, revealed that Egyptians had a surprisingly advanced grasp of human health, including the prevention and treatment of sexually transmitted infections. The use of protective sheaths was consistent with this medical knowledge, highlighting their proactive approach to health concerns. Moreover, the existence of these condoms also speaks to the broader Egyptian understanding of sexuality, not as a taboo, but as a natural and significant aspect of life. Sexuality was celebrated in art, literature, and religious symbolism, often linked to fertility gods like Min and Hathor. Protection, therefore, was not only a matter of safety, but part of a holistic approach to maintaining balance in body, spirit, and society. While these early condoms were primitive compared to the latex varieties of today, their very existence reveals an impressive early attempt at sexual health management. They remind us that human beings, regardless of era or culture, have always sought ways to navigate the complexities of desire and responsibility. In a world without antibiotics or modern contraception, such devices were vital tools in safeguarding health and well-being, especially in populous and cosmopolitan centers like Thebes. Their manufacture and use underscore the remarkable sophistication of ancient Egyptian civilization, a civilization deeply attuned to both the physical and spiritual dimensions of life. So next time we marvel at the towering pyramids or the mysteries of mummification, we might also remember the humble condom made from bull's skin, a testament to the Egyptians' innovative spirit and their enduring quest to protect and honor the sacredness of life in all its forms. Before his name would be sealed in golden cartouches and whispered through the sand-laced winds of Egypt, before his face would be immortalized behind a golden funerary mask, the boy who would become Pharaoh Tutankhamun was born in the shadows of a crumbling utopia. The year was somewhere around 1341 BCE. The land of Kemet, what we now call Egypt, trembled under the reign of a heretic king. Pharaoh Akhenaten, tall and strange-looking, had thrown away centuries of gods, temples, and traditions. He had declared the sun disk Aten, the one true god, elevating his own family to divine status and banishing the priesthood of Amun from the sacred cities of Thebes and Karnak. Into this strange and uncertain world, a child was born. His birth was not announced with fanfare. There was no grand procession of priests, no public proclamation in the courts of Amarna. The palace scribes recorded his name sparingly, if at all. His mother's identity remains lost to history. Some believe she was a lesser wife or concubine of Akhenaten. Others whisper that she may have been a sister, even a half-sister, as was often custom in the tangled bloodlines of the royal house. But in the half-light of Amarna, behind the walls of limestone and painted plaster, a child opened his eyes, and the world would one day remember him as Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Aten. The royal palace of Amarna was a place of both serenity and unease. Built by Akhenaten in a burst of divine inspiration, it stood as a monument to his new religion, a gleaming city laid out under the gaze of the unblinking sun. The architecture was different from anything Egypt had seen. There were no hidden corridors or shadowy sanctuaries. Everything was open to the light, symbolic of the king's desire for religious purity. But not all hearts were at ease in this sunlit world. The old gods were gone, their statues smashed, their names chiseled off walls. The people murmured in secret. The priests, once mighty, had vanished into exile or silence. And as Akhenaten gazed up at his god, the glowing orb of the Aten, his courtiers watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. In the nursery wing of the palace, young Tutankhamun was growing. His world was one of courtyards bathed in sun, soft voices in echoing halls, and caretakers who shielded him from the political tremors shaking the kingdom. One of those caretakers was a nurse named Maya, a woman of sharp eyes and a gentle voice. She was not noble, but she had been chosen for her loyalty and her silence. She was there when the child first laughed, when he took his first hesitant steps across the cool stone floor, when he uttered his first broken words. Tutankhamun, she would whisper, holding him close. Little one of light, son of the sun. But Maya also knew the truth. Light in Egypt cast long shadows, and even as the boy grew, those shadows grew with him. He was not alone in the palace. The daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the 6 princesses of the heretic dynasty, floated through the halls like living works of art, draped in white linen and perfumed with myrrh. Ankhesenpaten, the 3rd daughter, was closest to the boy in age, and they often played together in the palace gardens under the watchful eyes of their handlers. There were no sons of Akhenaten formally recorded as heirs, no towering princes in line for the throne. Only this boy, whose lineage was deliberately obscured, yet whose blood bore the unmistakable mark of royalty. In the evenings, when the sun fell low and the shadows grew longer, the boy would sit beside Maya and listen to tales of the gods. Though the worship of Aten was enforced in public, the old stories still lived on in whispers. She told him of Osiris and Isis, of Set's betrayal and Horus's revenge. The boy listened with wide eyes, his heart drawn not to the faceless Aten, but to the gods with voices, faces, and stories. "They're just myths," Maya would say, glancing nervously at the walls, "but they teach us who we are." Already something stirred in the boy that would one day lead him to undo all that his father had built. The court was not blind to the child. Viziers and generals, scribes and priests in hiding, they saw the boy's quiet strength, the way he watched, listened, and absorbed everything around him. He was delicate in frame, like his father, but his eyes held fire. There was something uncanny about him, something that made even the most hardened nobles pause when he entered a room. As he approached age 5, the political climate grew colder. Nefertiti vanished from public life. Some say she died, others that she ruled under a new name. One by one, Akhenaten's daughters were taken by illness or mystery. The court shrank. The palace halls became quieter, more solemn, and Akhenaten, once the radiant figurehead of the new religion, grew increasingly distant. He locked himself in his sanctuaries, speaking only to the Aten, surrounded by walls painted with golden rays and floating hands that offered him life. It was around this time that young Tutankhamun began to have dreams. In them, he stood on the banks of the Nile, facing a jackal-headed man with glowing eyes. In others, a falcon soared above his head, calling his name, not the one he had been given, but a different one, Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. He would wake with a gasp, sweat on his brow, his heart thundering. Maya would hold him, whispering comfort, not daring to ask what visions disturbed him. By the age of 7, the boy had begun his education in earnest. Tutors taught him to read hieroglyphs, to measure the stars, to speak in courtly tones. But not all his lessons came from books. I, his great-uncle, and a seasoned court official, began taking a more active role in his life. I had survived the upheaval of Amarna by staying quiet and useful. Now, he saw in Tutankhamun a chance to restore Egypt and himself to power. "There will be a day," I told the boy in hushed tones, "when the Aten sets, and when it does, Egypt will look to you." The words frightened and thrilled him. Was he truly meant for the throne? Was he not merely a child of the palace, a quiet observer in a dying kingdom? One evening, the boy overheard 2 servants whispering in the corridor. "The king is sick. He doesn't eat. He barely speaks." "He's cursed," said the other. "You can't defy the gods and live forever." Tutankhamun stepped away before they noticed him, but their words echoed in his ears. His father was fading. The world he had built was crumbling, and somewhere deep inside, the boy began to feel the pull of destiny. In the 8th year of Akhenaten's reign, the boy walked the royal gardens alone. The lotus flowers were in bloom, and dragonflies buzzed lazily through the warm air. He paused beside a small pond, watching his reflection ripple on the surface. "I am Tutankhamun," he whispered. Then quietly, defiantly, "I am Tutankhamun." Behind him, the city of Amarna slowly withered. The temples to Aten fell into disrepair. The golden sunlight that had once filled every corridor now seemed dimmed, weary. But the boy, Tutankhamun, whoever he was meant to be, stood beneath the sky and waited. He did not know it yet, but the winds of change were rising. Soon the boy born in shadows would become a king, and the gods, old and new, were watching. The sun was low in the sky over Amarna, burning dim behind a wall of wind-blown dust. A thick silence had fallen over the palace, not the usual stillness of midday, but the kind that comes when something sacred dies. Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, was gone. The servants moved like ghosts. Courtiers who once sang his praises now walked with heads bowed, avoiding one another's gaze. Some wept in corners, others simply vanished, sensing the shifting tides. For nearly 2 decades, Akhenaten had ruled with divine authority, reshaping Egypt in his image, replacing gods with a glowing disk in the sky. Now, his body lay cold, and with it, the new world he had built began to rot. The boy, Tutankhamun, stood at the edge of the royal courtyard in silence. He was 9 years old, and already the eyes of an empire were upon him. He had not been allowed into his father's death chamber. That space was reserved for priests of Aten, the few who still dared show their faces. But he had heard the gasping breath, the cries of servants, and the hurried shuffle of sandals on stone. He had watched the flame-lit procession carry the body away under the watch of painted walls that now seemed to stare back, accusingly. "I don't feel anything," he confessed to Maya, his nurse, that evening. She brushed a curl of dark hair from his forehead and frowned. "He was your father." "I know." He stared past her to the ceiling above. "But I don't feel like I knew him. Not really." And that was true. Akhenaten had ruled like a god, but he had lived like a ghost. The palace was filled with his image, yet he was rarely seen. The boy had learned from his tutors, played with Ankhesenpaten in the gardens, studied the language of priests and generals. But his father was distant, even in life. Now, in death, he felt more like a rumor than a man. Still, a pharaoh had died, and when a pharaoh dies, Egypt must answer. The priests were uneasy, the court fractured. With no older sons, no clear heir, the path to the throne should have been tangled. But all eyes turned to the boy, with the royal blood and the soft face. Young Tutankhamun, born of a secondary wife, still barely 10. I, the seasoned courtier, stepped forward as steward. He had no claim to the throne himself, but he had something more powerful: influence. As the elder statesman of the late king's court, he placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder and announced the transition. "Tutankhamun," he said before the council, "is the living son of the Aten. He will take the throne as his father did and rule in Ma'at, the sacred order." The nobles nodded slowly. The old guards remained silent. Even Horemheb, the general of the armies, said nothing. The time for rebellion would come later. So it was done. The boy became king. Not a man, not a warrior, just a child in a white linen robe, his head shaved, his eyes wide with uncertainty. The great double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt was too large for him. It had to be padded with cloth. The crook and flail, symbols of royal power, shook in his small hands as he raised them for the crowd. From a throne made for gods, the boy king began to reign. The coronation took place under the gaze of the Aten, of course. In Amarna's great temple, sunlight poured through skylights onto polished stone as the boy was anointed. The few priests of Aten still loyal came forth with sacred oil and incense, but it was clear this was not the world Akhenaten had ruled. His vision was fading. Even as the coronation finished, a secret meeting was taking place deep within the palace. I, Horemheb, and a handful of former priests of Amun stood in a narrow chamber lit by one flickering lamp. "The boy is Pharaoh," said I, "but he is not Akhenaten." "Good," said Horemheb. "We've lived under madness long enough. The people hate this place. They long for the old gods, for Thebes." I folded his arms. "We will guide him, quietly. He need not know what we do behind the veil." "And the queen?" one priest asked. "Ankhesenpaten is loyal," I replied, "and smart. We will marry her to the king." The room was silent for a moment. "He is barely 10. "So was she," I said, almost bitterly. "This is Egypt. Gods marry their sisters. Pharaohs have always done what they must." Weeks passed. The city of Amarna began to feel less like a holy place and more like a grave. Temples were left unguarded. Statues of Aten were quietly defaced in the night. Scribes stopped copying hymns. Even the sunlight seemed weaker. Tutankhamun wandered the palace in solitude. Now a king, he had fewer friends than before. Ankhesenpaten visited him often, her voice hushed, her face carefully calm. They shared quiet meals, walked in the gardens, spoke of dreams. "I dreamed I was flying," she told him one day, "but I couldn't look down. I was afraid I'd see the Nile turning black." He said nothing, but he dreamed too, of old gods calling his name, of men with falcon heads and jackals, of temples bursting from the sand. And in all his dreams, the same voice returned again and again. Tutankhamun. The change began slowly. At first, it was just whispers. The reappearance of certain priests in Thebes. The quiet reopening of old temples. Then a royal decree was issued. The royal family would now relocate from Amarna back to the ancient capital. Tutankhamun rode at the head of the procession, gold-clad and unreadable. Beside him, his young bride, now formally wed, wore the headdress of a queen, and behind them, carts rolled slowly down the dusty road, loaded not with treasure, but with broken idols and forbidden scrolls. When they arrived in Thebes, the city welcomed them like a long-lost son. The people wept with joy. The priests, once silenced, sang praises to Amun in the streets. And shortly after, a final decree was issued. The boy would change his name. No longer Tutankhamun, child of the sun disk. He would be Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. To the public, it was a miracle, a sign that the gods had returned. But inside the palace, the change felt more like an earthquake. Everything Akhenaten had built was being quietly erased. Tutankhamun stood in the temple of Karnak as the priests of Amun anointed him a second time. It was an odd thing to be crowned twice in the same lifetime, but this time he felt it in his bones. The air was thick with incense. The chants rolled through the stone halls like ancient thunder. He looked up at the towering columns, the painted ceilings, the massive statues of gods with animal heads and burning eyes. He had never seen anything so beautiful. The boy turned to Ai and whispered, "This is what Egypt feels like." Ai smiled thinly. "Yes, my pharaoh, this is Egypt as it was, and as it should be." But not everyone rejoiced. In the far reaches of the kingdom, loyalists to Aten muttered in secret, and in the minds of the high priests, another thought stirred. The boy may be pharaoh, but he would not rule forever. I ruled through him. Horemheb watched and waited. The court was a quiet battlefield. Yet Tutankhamun began to grow. He trained in swordplay. He learned the old rites. He began to take interest in temple rituals, court disputes, land reforms. He smiled more often. He laughed with his wife. He even oversaw the reopening of sacred festivals once banned by his father. He was still a boy, but he was becoming a king. And perhaps, just perhaps, he believed he could rule. But destiny, in Egypt, is written in limestone and ash. A heavy weight hung over his head, a crown that could break a child's spine. In the darkness of his chambers, he would often stand before a polished obsidian mirror and ask questions no one could answer. Who am I, truly? Was my father a madman or a prophet? Do the gods speak to me or through me? He was too young to rule, but Egypt had decided he must, and the sands of time never stop. The royal barge drifted slowly along the Nile, cutting through green banks and golden light, its polished hull catching the reflection of a godless sun. Around it, the river moved with timeless grace. Palm trees bowed gently in the breeze. Birds wheeled overhead, And behind, far behind, the spires of Amarna disappeared in the mist, as if the city had never existed at all. Tutankhamun stood at the prow, one hand clutching the carved railing, the other resting silently at his side. He had not spoken in hours. Beside him, Queen Ankhesenamun adjusted her headscarf against the wind and tried to read his expression. "You haven't eaten," she said softly. He didn't look at her. The priest said it would take 3 days to reach Thebes. They were wrong. It took 4. Tutankhamun's gaze lingered on the water, watching the reeds bend along the shore. "How do we go back to something we've never known?" he asked. She frowned. "What do you mean?" "Thebes, Amun, the gods of our ancestors. My father turned his back on them all. I was born under Aten's light. I barely remember the old rites." Ankhesenamun touched his arm gently. "Then we learn, like children again." He said nothing. Somewhere deep inside him, he knew she was right. But children did not wear crowns, or make decrees, or hold the fate of kingdoms in their hands. Thebes came into view like a rising memory. Great columns soared above the riverbanks. Obelisks pierced the sky. Temples vast and weathered sprawled like sleeping giants along the eastern and western shores. And among them, veiled in shadow, was the palace he would now call home. The palace of Thebes was older than memory. Unlike the radiant courtyards of Amarna, it was a place of thick stone walls, colonnades covered in hieroglyphs, and rooms so deep they swallowed sound. The sun, so central in his father's city, barely touched some corridors. Servants moved like wraiths through the gloom, whispering greetings, bowing low. Everything was draped in silence. Tutankhamun felt it immediately, the weight of it. The house of Pharaoh was not a home. It was a tomb for the living. Maya had once told him, "Palaces are never truly quiet. Listen close, and they speak." Now he heard them. Footsteps that echoed where no one walked. Hushed prayers muttered behind closed doors. The murmur of wind through halls carved by forgotten hands. He was Pharaoh now, but he was also a boy, and even in his new robes, his polished sandals, his gold-inlaid scepters, he felt like an intruder among ghosts. I greeted him at the threshold with a practiced smile and a bow too deep to be genuine. "Welcome home, Your Majesty," he said. "Thebes rejoices." Tutankhamun glanced past him. The wide entrance opened into a vast court where statues of long-dead kings watched with empty eyes. It smelled of stone and old incense. "I've never been here before," the boy said. He tilted his head. "Then allow me to guide you. It will be yours soon enough." The days that followed were filled with rituals, meetings, and endless ceremonies. Priests of Amun welcomed him back to the fold with chants and offerings. Old generals kissed the hem of his robe. Noblemen poured into the court, eager to align with the reborn order. But it all felt hollow. Tutankhamun watched them with a quiet detachment. They spoke of loyalty to him, but he knew they saw only a crown, not a child. Every word was measured, every gesture rehearsed. At night, he wandered the palace alone, cloaked and barefoot, navigating the labyrinth of rooms and corridors. One evening, he stumbled upon a sealed chamber behind the Hall of Offering. A cracked wooden door, its lintel worn with age. No guards, no torches, dust thick on the floor. Curious, he pushed it open. Inside was a chamber long forgotten. The walls were covered in faded murals, scenes from the old religion. Osiris judging the dead, Anubis preparing a body for burial, Thoth recording the names of souls. But the most striking figure was Amun-Ra, god of the sun, radiant and eternal. His arms stretched wide, embracing the universe. His face was chipped away, defaced during the reign of Aten, but still unmistakable. Tutankhamun stepped forward, the torchlight flickering against the paint. He was not alone. From the far side of the room, a low voice spoke. "You found it." He turned sharply. An elderly man emerged from the shadows, robes of indigo, eyes like carved obsidian. "Who are you?" Tutankhamun asked, instinctively reaching for the dagger at his belt. The man raised his hands. "A servant, a watcher, once a priest, before the Aten came." "Why are you here?" "I was left behind when the others fled. This room is my sanctuary." The boy narrowed his eyes. "You knew this chamber was here all along." "I did, as do others, but few enter. They fear what lingers." Tutankhamun glanced again at the god on the wall. "And what lingers?" The old man's smile was thin. "Truth, memory, power." The encounter haunted him. He spoke of it to no one, not even Tutankhamun. But something began to shift. He started asking questions about the reign of Akhenaten, about the temples destroyed, about the sacred objects seized or buried. He demanded scrolls and records. I resisted at first, urging patience, but the king was firm. "These are my ancestors," he said. "I have a right to know." And what he found disturbed him. Statues decapitated, shrines looted, priests imprisoned or exiled, thousands forced to abandon their gods, their rights, their entire world. His father had spoken of light, truth, purity, but the records showed something else. Tyranny cloaked in sunlight. One morning, he summoned I and Horemheb to the throne room. "I want the temples rebuilt," he declared, "not just to Amun, to all of them, Ptah, Thoth, Hathor, Isis. I want festivals resumed, the old rites restored." Horemheb's eyes flicked toward I, who remained silent. "My king," A said carefully, "there will be resistance." "Then let them resist," Tutankhamun replied. "Let them know the gods have returned." The months passed, and the palace came alive. Caravans arrived bearing cedar from Lebanon, granite from Aswan. Architects laid new foundations. Priests sang again in Karnak and Luxor. Commoners lined the roads to glimpse the young king, shouting his name, offering lotus flowers. Tutankhamun smiled more. He walked among the people, his golden sandals treading streets that no pharaoh had walked in decades. Children bowed, women wept, old men whispered blessings. And still at night, he walked the silent halls. He returned to the secret chamber, again and again. The murals were his quiet refuge. The old priest had vanished, but his words remained. One night, he stood before the image of Anubis and whispered, "Am I doing the right thing?" The silence answered, but not all was well. Rumors swirled in the court, whispers of plots, of enemies waiting for the boy to stumble. There were accidents, poisoned servants, messages intercepted. Even Tutankhamun grew wary. "I feel eyes watching me," she said one night, "even in my own chambers." Tutankhamun placed a hand on hers. "We must be careful. They smile in the day, but the knives come at night." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You're not a boy anymore." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. And then came the pain. It started in his left foot, a dull ache that grew sharper each day. Then his leg, his back. Some mornings, he couldn't walk without help. His gait became uneven. He limped through the court, refusing to show weakness. But behind closed doors, he collapsed into cushions, gasping. Physicians came with oils and charms. Incense burned in his chambers constantly, but the pain grew worse. Maya returned briefly to care for him, now old and bent. She wept quietly when she saw him. "You're too young for this," she said. "Perhaps I was never meant to be old," he whispered. And yet, he ruled. He signed decrees. He rebuilt temples. He breathed life into a kingdom nearly buried under sunlit rubble. But the palace remained silent. Still, deep within its bones, it remembered the gods. It remembered blood and fire. And it waited for the next shadow to fall. He stood alone in the hall of double truth, where the walls rose like pillars of eternity and echoed every footstep with ancient weight. A flood of golden light filtered in from the slatted roof above, dust motes dancing in the shafts like spirits. Tutankhamun, pharaoh of the two lands, was 12 years old. His bones ached. His foot, bound in linen, throbbed with every step. But he stood tall. Before him, the high priests of Amun, Ptah, and Thoth waited silently. Beside him, Queen Ankhesenamun stood still as a statue. Behind him, I and Horemheb loomed like shadowed guardians, one a cunning whisperer, the other a coiled serpent of war. The priests bowed deeply. Tutankhamun raised his staff of rulership. He did not use it for support, though the temptation was great. No, a pharaoh must stand, even when he bleeds inside. "I speak as Horus," the boy king said, his voice carrying through the sacred hall. "And Horus walks with the gods again." That was the signal, the formal restoration of divine order, the rejection of the heresy of Aten, the declaration that Amun and the ancient pantheon once more had the king's favor. A wave of relief washed over the court. For the priests, it was the return of breath after years of suffocation. For the nobles, it meant a return to the familiar, a world with rules, rituals, and ancestors to please. But for Tutankhamun, it was something else. It was a beginning, a dangerous, uncertain, thrilling beginning. In the following weeks, Thebes bloomed with life. Painted barges drifted down the Nile, bearing offerings. Festivals resumed. The beautiful Feast of the Valley, the great Opet procession, the dance of the sky goddesses. Music flooded the streets. Temples, long abandoned, flickered with torchlight and hymns. And at the center of it all was Tutankhamun. No longer merely a boy in ceremonial garb, he began issuing orders with his own seal. He commissioned statues of Amun. He sent offerings to Abydos. He listened to disputes in court, and sometimes made rulings that even I couldn't predict. "He grows bold," I said one night, pacing before Horemheb. The general, still clad in his bronze-studded armor, grunted. "He grows teeth." He was supposed to be moldable. All boys grow teeth, I. The question is whether he'll bite. Tutankhamun had begun holding private audiences. It was unheard of. Traditionally, a boy king was kept under the protection of a regent, filtered through priests and scribes. But now, nobles were summoned to meet him directly. One such noble was Ramos, a provincial governor from the south, who came bearing news of unrest. "The gold mines near Nubia are being raided," he said. "The workers fear the gods are angry. They say Aten's curse has followed them." Tutankhamun frowned. "Did you punish them?" Ramosa hesitated. I ordered 10 lashes for the ringleaders. And what of their priest? Dead, struck with fever. The people demand a new one." The boy turned to his scribe. "Send offerings to the temples in the south. Amun's favor must be visible, and double the rations for the miners." Ramose blinked. "Your Majesty, if we give them bread, they will give us gold. Isn't that what my great-grandfather Thutmose would have done?" The chamber fell silent. I, standing just behind the throne, smiled thinly. Horemheb, in the shadows, watched with an expression unreadable. The boy was watching too, learning, testing his power. And he liked the taste of it. In his private quarters, however, Tutankhamun was still just a boy, restless, curious, and increasingly lonely. The pain in his leg worsened. The physicians brought poultices, herbs, and imported salves from the Levant, but nothing helped. Some days he could barely rise from his bed. On others, He forced himself to walk through the palace gardens, leaning heavily on a cane, carved with lotus and papyrus. It was during one of these walks that he met Nacht, a stable boy no older than himself. Nacht had a sharp tongue and a quicker smile. He was brought in to oversee the king's chariots and keep the royal hunting dogs fed. "You don't bow," Tutankhamun said the first time they met. Nacht shrugged. "I thought you were just another crippled noble boy." Tutankhamun laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and unkingly. From then on, Nacht became a quiet presence in the young king's world. He told stories of the kitchens, of stable gossip, of guards who drank too much, and of girls who danced in the gardens after dusk. Tutankhamun began to feel human again. But human joy is a fragile thing in the court of gods. That winter, Queen Ankhesenamun lost her first child. The palace went quiet for 3 days. The women wailed. The physicians blamed the stars. The priests blamed Aten's curse. But no one said what they all feared. The royal line was fragile. Ankhesenamun withdrew from court for weeks. When she returned, her eyes were ringed with kohl so dark it looked like bruises. Tutankhamun said little. He took her hand each evening, walked with her along the palace walls, but the silence between them had grown too wide to bridge. "We were never given time to be children," she said once, "and now the gods want us to be parents." He said nothing, only stared at the black water of the Nile, where the moon shimmered like a drowned eye. Politics pressed in again. Horemheb, ever the soldier, pushed for expansion. Raids into Nubia, walls along the Sinai, embassies to the Hittites. I favored diplomacy, marriages, tributes, temples. Tutankhamun began attending war councils. He listened, asked questions, read dispatches from commanders along the Nile. One day, he stood up mid-meeting and struck his cane against the map. "No expansion this year," he said. "We rebuild at home. Our people have lost their gods, their bread, and their kings. Let's give them something back before we take more." Horemheb's jaw clenched, but he bowed. I, however, smiled again. "Your Majesty speaks with wisdom beyond your years." But in private he fumed. "He is not a puppet," A hissed to his wife Tay in their candlelit chamber. "He is a storm." "Then weather him," she replied, "or prepare to be swept away." Whispers of conspiracy began. Tutankhamun, sensing the tension, surrounded himself with a handful of trusted guards, young men like Nacht, loyal and fierce. He began inspecting records personally. He even visited temples alone, disguised as a commoner. It was during one such visit to Karnak that he overheard two priests arguing. "The boy plays Pharaoh, but he is still his father's son." "Bah, he walks with Amun now." "For now. But who speaks into his ear at night? I? The queen?" They stopped abruptly when he stepped into the light. "I speak for myself," Tutankhamun said coldly, "and the gods walk beside me." The priests fell to their knees. Years passed. The king grew older, though still frail. His bones thinned, his face matured, and his shoulders carried a heavier burden each day. Ankhesenamun bore him another child, a daughter, but she too died in infancy. The royal tombs began to fill before their time. Tutankhamun now limped constantly. His cane collection grew to dozens, each carved differently, some gifts from foreign kings, others adorned with spells and protection charms. One bore a lion's head. He leaned on that one when he climbed the steps of Luxor Temple during the grand festival of Opet. Thousands lined the path. Priests sang. The statue of Amun was carried through the streets. Tutankhamun stood at the top, gold crown shining, eyes hard. The people cheered. They saw a god made flesh. But he knew the truth. Inside, His body was failing. Inside, he was still just a boy who had never been allowed to be one. The summer heat pressed down like the weight of the gods. Thebes shimmered in gold and dust, its white stones glowing under the pitiless eye of Ra. In the royal palace, Tutankhamun sat before a brazier of smoldering myrrh, staring into the coals as though they might offer him answers the living could not. His cane rested against his knee. His breath came slow and deliberate. He was older now, still a boy by age but a king by pain. The pain in his foot was no longer occasional. It was constant, growing bolder each morning, as if it too were vying for power in his fragile body. His physicians, wise men from Heliopolis and Kush, smeared his joints with resin, wrapped his limbs in soft linen, and spoke of curses in half-whispers when they thought he couldn't hear. He could always hear. That morning, a courier from Akhmim arrived bearing scrolls, sealed with wax the color of dried blood. The wax bore the signet of a woman long vanished from the world of the living, the royal cartouche of Neferuaten Nefertiti. Tutankhamun's pulse quickened as he took the scroll. He did not open it in the hall. Instead, he dismissed the chamber, took the scroll to his private study, and broke the seal alone. Inside was not a letter, but a record, a transcription, a remnant of a voice once silenced. He read it, slowly, line by line, his breath catching. My husband walks in the light of Aten, but the shadows grow longer in his wake. It was a passage from one of Nefertiti's last priestess writings, discovered hidden in a temple ruin. The archivists had been excavating the remains of a scorched storeroom beneath the old palace in Amarna. Behind scorched cedar boxes and shattered alabaster, they had found a sealed niche, and within it, scrolls, unmarked, untitled, but unmistakable in tone. Nefertiti's voice, preserved like linen-wrapped flesh. I watch our daughters fall, one by one. I see the empire unravel like flax thread beneath the loom. He speaks of Aten's glory, but I hear no gods in our halls, only silence and weeping. Tutankhamun's fingers trembled as he read. These were not the words of the goddess-like queen painted on palace walls. They were the words of a woman lost in grief, in doubt, in rage. She had known the kingdom was crumbling. She had known Akhenaten was dying in spirit long before the body followed. And yet her fate remained a blank page. The scroll ended with a phrase not meant for any eyes but her own. I will not be remembered, but I will not forget. Tutankhamun rolled the parchment carefully, placed it inside a hollowed stone jar, and locked it in a chest in his sleeping chamber. He did not sleep that night. The next morning, he summoned Ankhesenamun. She came in silence, her face composed but wary. He didn't speak at first, only watched her. You know of her, he said at last. Who? She replied, though her voice betrayed her. Nefertiti. Ankhesenamun's shoulders dropped. Everyone knows of her. Not like I do, not anymore. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing. What did you find? He hesitated. A voice, one that was never meant to survive, and in it, fear of my father, of what he was becoming. She knew the empire was dying. Ankhesenamun nodded slowly. We all did. Did she die? The queen looked away. She vanished. Vanished how? No one knows, not even I. But someone must know. Someone always knows. Her voice dropped to a whisper. She walked into the temple one night, alone, and never came out. Was it a sacrifice? He asked. A long pause. Or an escape. Tutankhamun looked down at his hands, once smooth, now marked with the first signs of adulthood. His ringed fingers curled. She was my stepmother, he said. She raised my sisters. She shaped the world that shaped me. She tried, Ankhesenamun replied softly, but even she couldn't hold it together. The whispers returned. Not from the priests or the generals, but from the people in the streets. Rumors of sightings. An old woman seen walking the edges of the desert near Amarna. A voice heard in the wind near the ruined temples. Nefertiti, they said, had not died. She had fled, become something else. A priestess, a ghost, a goddess in hiding. Tutankhamun listened to these tales with a strange ache in his chest, part longing, part guilt. That week, he ordered the reopening of the tombs at Amarna, not to disturb the dead, but to find the missing. He wanted her name, her body, her truth. What he found was a wall, sealed tight with ancient mortar, behind which lay a small, unfinished chamber. Inside it, a shattered alabaster bust. He knew the face instantly. Every child in Egypt knew the face of Nefertiti. Even broken, it radiated power. He touched it. The stone was cold. Why did they destroy her? He asked aloud. There was no answer, only the wind and the scent of dust. Back in Thebes, I met him in the Hall of Blue Lotus. She is a shadow, the old man said. Let her stay that way. Tutankhamun glared at him. You knew where she was buried. I did not blink. No, but I know why no one speaks of her, because speaking her name brings back the fire, the ruin. She was a queen. She was a ghost with a crown. She threatened the balance. So you erased her. A's lips tightened. I did what I must, for the sake of the two lands. You always do. The tension hung like a knife between them. I'm not my father, Tutankhamun said at last, but I won't be your shadow either. I bowed deeply. As you will, my king. But his eyes did not lower. That night, Tutankhamun returned to the secret chamber beneath the palace, the one with the murals of Amun, Osiris, Thoth, the place where silence had first spoken to him. There, under torchlight, he unrolled the scroll again. He read the lines aloud. He let Nefertiti speak through his lips. I see the world unmaking itself. I see the temples crack and the gods fall silent. And in that silence, I find the only truth that remains. We are all forgotten. He folded the scroll slowly, pressing it to his forehead. I won't forget you, he whispered, even if they all do. From the shadows of the hall, a breath stirred. Not wind, something deeper. A presence. He turned, but no one was there. Only the mural of Osiris, god of death and rebirth, watching. In the months that followed, Tutankhamun grew colder. Not cruel, but harder. The boy's laughter became rare. His walk slower, even with the cane. His voice deeper, more deliberate. He ruled with a focus few had expected. Temples flourished, trade reopened, Egypt bloomed. But in his eyes, the palace saw the weight of the dead. Not just Nefertiti, not just Akhenaten, but every voice lost in the cracks between the stones. He started a new tomb project, not for himself, for her. A hidden valley near Amarna, no great monument, no towering statue, just a single chamber, carved into the stone, sealed with her name. Neferuaten Nefertiti, the one who vanished, the one who should not be forgotten. And there, in a stone box, he placed the scroll, and with it, the boy who had once played in the palace gardens under Aten's light was gone forever. Only the pharaoh remained. And the silence, always the silence. The flood season came late that year. The Nile, sluggish and dark, crept beyond its banks with a hesitancy that made farmers nervous and priests unsettled. Offerings to Hapi, god of the flood, increased. Bulls were slaughtered in the temples. Scribes recorded water levels on limestone staves with silent dread. A poor inundation meant less grain, which meant less bread, which meant whispers in alleys and curses muttered into clay pots. Tutankhamun stood beneath the high columns of the temple of Amun, watching the priests chant. The air was thick with incense and the scent of damp stone. Outside, the rain had stopped hours ago, but the damp still clung to his cloak. He no longer wore the bright linen of childhood. His robes were dark, his collar heavy with lapis and turquoise, his skin paler than it had been. His cane, always present now, had been inlaid with ivory and gold by the finest craftsmen of Memphis. He leaned on it more heavily with each passing week, though he never allowed his servants to see him wince. The high priest approached him as the chanting ended. His face aged and cracked like a weathered statue. "The river is low, my king," he said gravely, "but the gods may yet be appeased." Tutankhamun looked past him, toward the open doors, where the Nile glittered in the distance. "I wonder," he murmured, "if the gods are listening anymore." The priest stiffened. "Surely they have been neglected," the king interrupted, "for too long. My father silenced their names. We have only begun to speak again." The priest bowed. "Then let us speak louder." The next day, Tutankhamun ordered a feast to be held in the Valley of the Kings, not for the living, but for the dead. Hundreds of priests and priestesses were summoned. Offerings were carried in great woven baskets. Hymns echoed through tomb entrances that hadn't seen light in decades. It was a gesture, both spiritual and political, a message that the old ways were not only being restored, but honored. And yet, the water continued to fall short. By the end of the month, food prices rose. Grain storages grew thin. Tensions simmered. Tutankhamun met with his council. I sat to his right, Horemheb to his left, with generals, scribes, and temple stewards arrayed like vultures around a dying lion. "We can import from Canaan," one said. "We should ration what we have," another offered. "No," Tutankhamun said. "We send grain to the provinces. The people must eat." I frowned. "And Thebes? We'll survive. The nobles will not agree." "The nobles," the boy king said, his voice sharp, "do not rule Egypt." There was a silence. No one dared contradict him. That evening, Ankhesenamun found him alone on the rooftop, the wind tugging at his cloak. "You're losing weight," she said. He didn't look at her. "Everyone is." She stepped beside him. "You can't save everyone." "I know." They stood together for a long time, watching the moon rise over the darkened Nile. "When I was a child," he said quietly, "I used to believe the gods lived in the stars, that if I died, I'd go up and become one of them." "You still might," she said. He laughed once, bitterly. "No, I think I'm already becoming a ghost." One morning, a report arrived from the Delta. Unrest. A shrine to Aten had been uncovered during the construction of a new temple to Osiris. The workers refused to destroy it. Some claimed they had seen lights in the stones at night, heard whispers when they approached. Tutankhamun ordered it sealed again, this time with bricks and prayers, but it unsettled him. The ghost of his father was everywhere, in forgotten alcoves, in old paintings, in the words of travelers who still whispered the Aten's name behind closed doors. He began dreaming of the sun disk again. In his sleep, it bled light like fire, scorching the land, melting the temples of Amun into glass. He saw his own face in the dream, split in two, one half golden and smooth, the other skeletal and rotting. He awoke soaked in sweat, clawing at the sheets. Maya, now frail and nearly blind, brought him a cup of pomegranate juice the next morning. "You look thin," she said gently. "I am," he admitted. "You dream?" "Too often." She took his hand, her old fingers trembling. "I named you, you know. I was there when your first breath came. You were silent for so long we thought you wouldn't live, but you opened your eyes and stared at the world like you already hated it." He smiled faintly. Maybe I did. You have the face of your father, but not the soul. Good. Don't let their gods bury you. He gripped her hand tighter. I don't know whose gods are even mine anymore. Time blurred. He turned 18. Another child was born to Tutankhamun and lost before her first breath. The palace mourned quietly. No grand funeral, no announcement. Just another swaddled bundle carried out in silence. The queen stopped smiling after that. She wore white for months, refusing gold or cosmetics. Tutankhamun spoke less and ruled more. He sent gifts to Syria. He received diplomats from Libya. He ordered more temples built. But now, they bore not only the names of the old gods, but his own cartouche, larger and bolder. He began to speak of legacy, of death, and of eternity. In the temple of Hathor, deep in the western hills, a new statue was erected. It bore Tutankhamun's likeness, not as a boy or a young man, but as a god, arms crossed, eyes unblinking, skin carved from black granite. Tutankhamun stood before it one evening and whispered, "This is how they will remember you." He stood behind her. "I hope they remember more than a statue." "They won't. I know." The illness worsened. His spine bent slightly. His steps grew slower. He stopped traveling outside the city. Nakht, still loyal, still fearless, became his closest companion, his eyes and ears beyond the palace walls. "People say your days are numbered," Nakht said one night as they sat playing Senet in the garden. "Whose aunt?" Tutankhamun replied. "Some say I prepares to take the throne. He's waited long enough. You're not going to stop him." The king moved a piece on the board, capturing Nakht's. Let him try. And then came the fall. It happened quietly, with no witnesses. He was in the inner sanctuary of Karnak, making a private offering. Something cracked, a sound like splitting stone. He collapsed. The guards found him, minutes later, breath shallow, eyes unfocused. They carried him back to the palace. And for days, he drifted between worlds. He saw his father, faceless, weeping. He saw Nefertiti, her hands stained with red ochre, painting symbols on his skin. He saw the gods, all of them, seated in judgment. And when he awoke, he could no longer walk. The end was near. He summoned I. "Swear to me," he said from his bed, "you will not take her." A said nothing. "She is my wife, not your prize." "I swear," A lied. He summoned Tutankhamun. "You must write to the Hittites," she gasped. "You want me to marry one of their princes. It will stop I. He can't take the throne if you are queen. You would ally with our enemies. I would save Egypt from him." And she did. She wrote the letter. And the Hittite prince rode for Thebes, but he never arrived. Assassins waited for him in the desert. Some said I ordered it. Some said Horemheb. Some said the gods themselves. Tutankhamun died on a cold morning. The palace did not ring bells. The priests did not sing hymns. The news spread in whispers. The boy king, the one who restored the gods, who walked in pain but ruled in light, was gone. His body was taken to the Valley of the Kings. His tomb, small and hastily prepared, was filled with treasures beyond imagination. Gold, ebony, chariots he never rode, thrones he never sat in, statues of gods who may or may not have listened. He was sealed behind stone and silence. And Egypt moved on. But the world did not forget. Not forever. Thousands of years later, when his tomb was opened by men who did not speak his language, who lit their way with electric light and wore foreign clothes, the gods stirred. And the boy king rose again, not in flesh, but in memory. His name, once nearly lost, became legend. His mask, his curse, his eyes, all returned. Tutankhamun. the king who died young, the god who would not be erased. The waning light of the afternoon cast long shadows over the palace walls of Thebes, curling around the towering columns and whispering secrets of a kingdom poised on the edge of change. Tutankhamun's once vibrant eyes, now dulled by pain and burden, rested on the intricate carvings that adorned his chamber, scenes of gods and kings, victory and judgment, all frozen in stone, silent witnesses to a boy's journey toward an uncertain fate. Inside the grand halls, beneath the echo of ceremonial drums and whispered prayers, a different kind of battle simmered, one not fought with chariots or swords, but with glances, secrets, and the unyielding weight of ambition. Tutankhamun, barely 19, was no longer the boy who had laughed with Nakht by the stables, or marveled at the murals hidden deep within the palace. The illness that had slowly gnawed at his body tightened its grip. His steps were slower, his breathing labored. The golden crown felt heavier than ever, not just from its weight, but from the crushing responsibility it symbolized. Yet despite his frailty, his mind burned with a fierce determination to protect his queen, to secure his legacy, and to defy the shadows that sought to engulf him. I, the old vizier, loomed ever closer, his eyes sharp, his smile thin, his patience wearing thin as well. Though he had sworn fealty, his heart pulsed with the hunger for power, and the opportunity to claim the throne danced tantalizingly before him. Horemheb, the general, stood at the edge of the unfolding storm, a man of iron will and calculated silence, his loyalty ambiguous, his ambitions carefully masked beneath a veneer of discipline. Ankhesenamun, once the radiant bride, now moved with the heavy grace of a woman forged in sorrow, her love for Tutankhamun tempered by the knowledge of the peril that encircled them like a tightening noose. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the palace was bathed in the soft glow of oil lamps, Tutankhamun called his closest confidants to his chamber. The room was hushed except for the distant murmur of the Nile and the faint rustle of palm fronds outside the open windows. Nakht, the stable boy turned loyal guard, stood by the doorway, his eyes alert and unwavering. I sat near the king's bed, his fingers steepled, watching with a calm that masked the storm beneath. Horemheb paced silently, his expression unreadable. Ankhesenamun sat beside her husband, her fingers entwined with his, offering strength where words failed. The king's voice, though weakened, carried the steel of command. "We must prepare," he said, each word deliberate, "for what comes when I am gone." I inclined his head. "Your wishes will be honored." "No," Tutankhamun said sharply. "No half measures. I will not let the throne be stolen." Horemheb's gaze flicked to I. Ankhesenamun squeezed Tutankhamun's hand. "What do you want us to do?" He looked around the room, eyes lingering on each face. "Send word to the Hittites again," he whispered. "They must know the alliance is still our hope." I frowned. "Their prince is dead. He was killed before he could arrive. We must send another." "And if they refuse?" Ankhesenamun asked. "Then we fight," Tutankhamun answered, "for Egypt's future, for our children, for the gods who still watch." The days that followed were a blur of secret meetings and coded messages. Couriers slipped through the city under cover of darkness, carrying fragile hope wrapped in papyrus. At the same time, I and Horemheb wove their own webs of influence, cultivating alliances among the nobles and generals who would decide Egypt's fate. Within the palace, every glance, every word, was a calculated move in a deadly game. The boy king's strength waned, but his will grew fiercer. He appointed loyalists to key positions, quietly removing those who favored A's ambitions. Ankhesenamun stood resolute, her resolve hardened by grief and love, vowing to protect the throne and her husband's memory at any cost. One night, Tutankhamun dreamed again. The golden sun split like a shattered mirror, casting fractured light over the desert sands. He stood at the gates of the afterlife, facing Osiris, the god of death and resurrection. "Your time is near, child of the gods," Osiris intoned, his voice deep as the river. "I am not ready," Tutankhamun replied. "The legacy you leave is stronger than the flesh you inhabit. But I fear what happens after." Osiris smiled, eyes filled with ancient sorrow. "Fear is the companion of kings, but courage is their path." He awoke with a start, the torchlight flickering against the walls. Nakht was at his side, eyes wide with concern. "Pharaoh, you called?" Tutankhamun grasped his friend's hand. "Tell the queen, we must be ready." The final weeks of Tutankhamun's life unfolded in a haze of pain and purpose. The palace grew quiet, mourning the slow fading of its light. His servants whispered prayers, priests chanted beneath the vaulted ceilings, and the Nile flowed unceasing, as if to remind the world that life and death were but two sides of the same eternal river. His last act as pharaoh was to call for a scribe and compose a decree. He wrote of unity, of peace, and of the eternal bond between Egypt and its neighbors. He sealed it with his ring, a symbol that would outlast him. Then, surrounded by those he trusted most, he closed his eyes. The sun rose on a new dawn without Tutankhamun. I ascended the throne with practiced ease, his smile masking the tumult beneath. Ankhesenamun, now queen regent, held the kingdom together even as shadows lengthened and alliances shifted like desert sands. Horemheb watched from the sidelines, waiting. And the gods, silent witnesses to the mortal struggle, bore witness to the end of a boy king's reign and the beginning of a new era for Egypt. The morning sun seeped cautiously through the lattice windows of the palace, casting fractured patterns of light and shadow upon the stone floors. The halls were unusually quiet, the usual bustle of servants and courtiers replaced by a heavy stillness that pressed upon the heart of Thebes like a shroud. The boy king was dead. I sat on the throne, its polished gold gleaming coldly beneath his fingers. His eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned the courtiers gathered before him, faces painted with grief, fear, and curiosity. He wore the royal Nimes headdress with practiced ease, but behind his carefully composed expression, a storm brewed. The delicate balance of power had shifted. With Tutankhamun's passing, the fragile peace the young pharaoh had struggled to maintain was now fragile threads in the wind, threatening to unravel. Ankhesenamun, the young widow queen, sat in a secluded chamber, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her beauty, once radiant and full of promise, was now muted by sorrow and resolve. She was no longer the boy king's innocent bride, but a woman, forced to navigate a treacherous path where every step could mean survival or death. The Hittites had been silent since the assassination of their prince. A dagger plunged not just into their bloodline, but into the heart of the hopes Tutankhamun had pinned upon their alliance. The palace whispered of conspiracies, of secret meetings in shadowed corridors where plots thickened like the desert dust after a rare storm. I, the new pharaoh, moved swiftly to consolidate his grip on the throne. He appointed loyalists to key positions, sidelining those who had remained faithful to Tutankhamun's vision. Horemheb, the general who had once been the young king's protector, was forced to retreat into the background, his ambitions curbed by the tightening web of Ai's influence. Ankhesenamun, however, was not content to fade quietly into the background. Her spirit, hardened by loss and betrayal, burned with the desire to preserve her husband's legacy. She summoned her trusted advisors and began to weave plans that might yet save Egypt from the tides of chaos threatening to engulf it. Word spread that she sought a new husband, not a mere political alliance, but a partner strong enough to challenge and restore the dynasty. Horemheb, still revered by the military, was the natural candidate. Their union, however, was fraught with danger and suspicion. Rumors swirled that Ayi would never relinquish his claim without a fight, and that the palace was a battlefield where friends and foes wore masks of loyalty. In the midst of this turmoil, Egypt's borders grew restless. Tribes from the south tested the defenses along the Nubian frontier, while marauding bands in the north exploited the kingdom's distracted attention. Trade routes faltered as merchants hesitated to travel through unstable lands. The gods, once again, seemed silent. Ankhesenamun, aware that her strength alone could not secure Egypt's future, reached out to the priests of Amun. She offered grand sacrifices and rebuilt altars destroyed during Akhenaten's reign, seeking to restore favor and stability through divine intervention. At night, she wandered the temple halls, praying beneath flickering torches, her voice rising in ancient hymns that echoed through the stone. Yet even as she sought solace in faith, the palace's shadows lengthened. One evening, as the moon hung low and red over the Nile, a messenger arrived with urgent news. I had fallen ill. Whispers spread that the old vizier's sickness was not natural. Poison, some claimed. A curse, others murmured. In the corridors, eyes flickered with fear and suspicion. Horemheb, sensing opportunity, began to rally his supporters quietly, preparing for the moment when he could step from the shadows and claim the throne, not as a usurper, but as the savior Egypt desperately needed. Ankhesenamun watched, all with weary eyes, her heart heavy with the burden of a kingdom teetering on the edge. She knew the path ahead would demand sacrifices, of trust, of love, and perhaps of her own life. And so, beneath the watchful stars and the ever-flowing Nile, Egypt held its breath, waiting for the dawn of a new era. The courtyards of the royal palace lay draped in silence, a fragile hush hanging heavy in the air, as if the very stones mourned the loss of their young king. The sun, rising slowly over the Nile's shimmering expanse, cast its first golden light on a kingdom poised on the edge of chaos. The passing of Tutankhamun was not merely the death of a boy, but the shattering of a fragile dream, a dream of unity, revival, and the reclaiming of Egypt's ancient glory. Ankhesenamun sat alone in the private chambers that once echoed with her husband's laughter and hope. Her hands trembled as she clasped the thin veil that covered her face, the weight of her crown more a burden than an honor. Around her, the palace hummed with whispers. Whispers of power, betrayal, and the uncertain future that now awaited the throne. I, the old vizier, who had seized power swiftly and silently, wore the garb of a king, but lacked the boy's bright fire. His eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had waited years in the shadows to grasp his moment. Yet the people murmured doubts. Could a man so old, so entwined in the politics of the court, rule a land yearning for renewal? And then there was Horemheb, the general whose silent presence loomed like a storm gathering at the horizon. He had been Tutankhamun's protector, the sword and shield of a boy king ill-prepared for the brutal tides of history. Now, with the throne vacant, Horemheb's ambitions stirred in the depths of his mind, his every move watched by those who feared his power. Ankhesenamun's own position was precarious. Widowed young, stripped of the support she once held as queen, alongside Tutankhamun, she was a figure both revered and feared. Her voice was soft, but carried steel. Her beauty was marked now with lines of sorrow, but also with determination. To survive and to protect her late husband's legacy, she would need all her cunning and courage. The alliance with the Hittites, the fragile hope Tutankhamun had pinned on foreign blood, was now fractured and uncertain. The death of the Hittite prince in Egypt's deserts was a blow not only to diplomacy but to Ankhesenamun's desperate plan to secure Egypt's future through marriage and alliance. Letters sent in the dead king's name remained unanswered. The possibility of renewed war with a powerful neighbor loomed like a specter. Inside the palace walls, secret meetings took place beneath flickering torchlight. Shadows twisted as courtiers plotted and schemed. Loyalties shifted like desert sands. Some sought to support Ankhesenamun, viewing her as a symbol of continuity and hope. Others rallied behind Ai, who wielded power like a clenched fist. Still others looked to Horemheb, whose discipline and military might promised a different future. One night, under a moonless sky, Ankhesenamun met with her closest confidants in the hidden chambers beneath the palace. Nakht, the loyal servant, who had risen from humble beginnings to become her protector, stood beside Horemheb and a handful of trusted nobles. The air was thick with tension. "We must act swiftly," Ankhesenamun said, her voice steady despite the weight of fear pressing upon her. "Egypt cannot endure another season of uncertainty." Horemheb nodded. "The army is restless. The people grow anxious. Ai's hold on power is tenuous." Nakht spoke quietly, but with conviction. "The priests of Amun will not support Ai. They see the boy king as a son of the gods. We must honor that." "And the Hittites?" asked one noble, a man whose scarred face told tales of countless battles. "Dead silence," Ankhesenamun replied grimly. "Their prince is gone. Their envoys have turned away. We are alone." Plans were drawn. Alliances forged in whispers. Messages sent to distant provinces, urging loyalty to the late king's bloodline. Meanwhile, Ai tightened his grip, imprisoning dissenters and rewarding those who pledged fealty. Yet the kingdom's problems were not only political. The Nile's annual flood had once again been weak, bringing famine to many. Crops failed, and with them, the people's patience. Riots flared in the cities. Temples once grand fell into disrepair. The god's silence seemed a curse. Ankhesenamun moved among her people, disguised at times, listening to their fears, their anger. She wept silently for the boy who had tried so hard to save Egypt. She vowed she would not let his efforts be in vain. But her enemies were many. Ai's spies infiltrated her circle. Horemheb's generals watched her every move. Her nights were haunted by visions of Tutankhamun, his golden mask gleaming in the dark, his eyes pleading for justice. One morning, news arrived of a plot, an attempt on Ai's life. The palace was thrown into chaos. Fingers were pointed. Executions, swift and brutal, followed. Ankhesenamun's own safety became a question. Should she flee? Could she fight? She chose to fight. Her union with Horemheb was sealed. A marriage born not of love, but necessity. Together, they would challenge Ai's reign. But Ai was no fool. The battle for Egypt's future was about to erupt in blood and fire. And through it all, the memory of Tutankhamun, the boy king who had dared to dream, would be the light guiding their paths through the darkness. The palace, once a sanctuary of gold and song, now echoed with the heavy footsteps of uncertainty. Ankhesenamun moved through the grand halls, her gaze sharp, her heart steeled against the whispers that sought to unsettle her. The union with Horemheb was more than a marriage. It was a pact forged in fire and desperation, a beacon against the encroaching darkness of Ai's reign. Horemheb, standing tall and resolute beside her, carried the weight of the army and the hopes of a nation. His presence was a promise of strength, yet beneath his disciplined exterior, a storm brewed, a mix of loyalty ambition, and the shadow of a future yet unwritten. The days following their union were fraught with tension. Courtiers whispered in corners. Spies slipped through the palace corridors like shadows, and the delicate balance of power threatened to collapse. I, sensing his hold weakening, moved swiftly to crush dissent. But the seeds of rebellion had taken root. Ankhesenamun and Horemheb convened secret councils beneath the cover of night. They planned, they plotted, they reached out to provincial governors and military commanders whose loyalty was uncertain. Letters sealed with the young king's emblem were sent as reminders of the true bloodline, of the promises made to the gods and the people. Meanwhile, the Nile continued its unpredictable dance. The land groaned under the strain of poor harvests, and famine threatened to ignite unrest beyond the palace walls. The people, weary and desperate, looked to their leaders for salvation, their prayers echoing in empty temples. Ankhesenamun, once sheltered behind silk and gold, now walked among her people. She listened to their stories of hardship, their fears of the future. Each tale hardened her resolve, fueling her determination to restore the kingdom's glory. Yet even as plans for revolt brewed, a different kind of battle raged within her. The memory of Tutankhamun haunted her waking moments and her dreams. His laughter, his hopes, his untimely death, a wound that refused to heal. She wondered if she could live up to the legacy he had left behind, if the gods would grant her the strength to see Egypt through its darkest hours. The night before the planned uprising, she stood beneath the stars, the cool desert breeze carrying the scent of lotus and myrrh. She whispered a prayer to Isis, goddess of magic and protection. "Guide me," she pleaded. "Give me the courage to protect your children, to honor the boy king's name." Horemheb joined her silently, his hand steadying hers. "We fight for Egypt," he said, "for the future." "For Tutankhamun," she replied. The dawn broke with the sound of trumpets and the clatter of armor. The palace erupted into chaos as loyalists clashed with Ai's guards. Streets flooded with soldiers. Banners bearing the cartouche of the young king waved defiantly. The battle was swift but brutal. Ai's forces, though numerous, were fractured by fear and betrayal. Horemheb's strategy, honed by years of warfare, turned the tide. Within days, Ai was captured, stripped of power, and exiled to the desert's harsh embrace. Victory was bittersweet. The cost was high, the scars deep. Ankhesenamun and Horemheb stood together on the palace steps, looking out over a kingdom both wounded and hopeful. Egypt's future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, it was theirs to shape. The golden rays of the sun spilled over Thebes, illuminating the city's ancient stones and the restless faces of its people. The great temple of Karnak stood proudly against the sky, its towering columns inscribed with the names of forgotten kings and gods who had watched over Egypt since time immemorial. Yet beneath this veneer of grandeur, the land trembled under the weight of uncertainty and change. Ankhesenamun walked slowly through the bustling streets of the city, cloaked modestly despite the silk robes that graced her form. The hum of life filled the air, vendors hawking their goods, children chasing each other through narrow alleys, priests chanting prayers to Amun-Ra. To the untrained eye, it was a city in renewal. But she saw beneath the surface glimpses of desperation in tired eyes, the toll of hunger in gaunt cheeks, and the scars of loss etched into every soul. The death of Tutankhamun had left a void, but it had also sparked a flicker of hope. His legacy, fragile as it was, now rested on Ankhesenamun's shoulders, and the strength of her new husband. Horemheb, the former general turned pharaoh. Their alliance was a union of necessity, ambition, and shared responsibility. Together, they bore the burden of restoring Egypt's greatness, a task complicated by court intrigues, external threats, and the slow, steady decay of the land's ancient institutions. Inside the palace, Ankhesenamun's chambers were a refuge from the clamor of the court, yet even here, the whispers of discontent followed her like shadows. Advisors debated endlessly over policy, priests vied for influence, and generals awaited orders that could decide the fate of provinces far from the Nile's banks. One morning, as the first light filtered through the alabaster windows, Ankhesenamun sat at a low table, strewn with scrolls and reports. Her fingers brushed over the papyrus, tracing the lines of maps that detailed rebellious territories and border skirmishes. The southern province of Nubia simmered with unrest, and the reports from the delta spoke of discontent among the merchants and peasants alike. Horemheb entered quietly, his presence commanding yet tempered by the wisdom of years spent in battle and governance. His gaze met hers, and in that look lay a conversation unspoken but deeply felt. "The southern tribes grow bolder," he said. "If we do not act, they may sever Egypt's lifeline." Ankhesenamun nodded, folding one of the scrolls. "War will bring death and famine. We must find a way to bind them with peace, not just fear." He considered her words, the fire of his martial spirit tempered by her compassion. "Then we offer them gifts, aid, and the promise of protection." Their partnership was not only one of rulers, but of minds and hearts united by a vision that stretched beyond the immediate crisis. Together, they devised a plan to send envoys laden with food and gold, hoping to quell the rebellion with diplomacy before the clash of swords became inevitable. As days turned to weeks, Ankhesenamun visited the temples and marketplaces, speaking with priests and commoners alike. She sought to understand their needs, their fears, and their hopes. In the great temple of Amun, she offered sacrifices and prayers, seeking favor from the gods whose worship had been suppressed during Akhenaten's reign. The priests welcomed her efforts, their chants and rituals filling the vast halls with a renewed sense of divine presence. Yet the tensions between the old ways and new lingered like a persistent breeze, whispering of revolutions past and futures uncertain. In the evenings, the queen would retire to her private garden, a small sanctuary where lotus blooms scented the air and the stars shone with quiet brilliance. There she reflected on the challenges ahead, the fragile peace, the burden of leadership, and the memory of Tutankhamun, whose brief life had changed the kingdom forever. Her thoughts often turned to the boy king's golden mask, now enshrined in the tomb deep within the Valley of the Kings, a symbol of a reign cut short, yet immortalized by the treasures buried with him. That mask, gleaming with lapis lazuli and gold, was both a beacon and a reminder that Egypt's fate was as precious and fragile as the life it had lost. Meanwhile, the court was not without its dangers. I, though exiled, maintained loyalists who plotted in the shadows. Reports of assassinations and secret meetings trickled through the grapevine, unsettling the peace Ankhesenamun and Horemheb sought to build. Horemheb, ever the soldier, tightened security and held counsel with his generals. The army, though weary from years of conflict, remained a formidable force, a necessary bulwark against both internal dissent and external threats. One day, a messenger arrived with grim news. A caravan bound for the northern city of Memphis had been ambushed by raiders, merchants slain, goods stolen. The fragile trade routes that sustained Egypt's wealth and influence were under siege. Ankhesenamun convened her council, the air thick with tension. "We must secure the borders," she declared. The prosperity of Egypt depends on the safety of its people and its commerce. Plans were set in motion to fortify key points along the Nile and dispatch patrols to deter further raids. The Queen's resolve was mirrored by the generals, who saw in her a leader willing to balance mercy with strength. As months passed, small victories bolstered the fragile unity. Rebellions were quelled not only by force, but through negotiations and promises of aid. The temples were restored, and the god's presence seemed to return in the rituals performed daily by priests grateful for the return of royal favor. Yet Ankhesenamun remained haunted by the shadows of the past. The spiritual upheaval sparked by Akhenaten's reign had left scars in the collective memory of the people. Some still whispered that the gods had turned their backs on Egypt, that the land's suffering was punishment for forgotten sins. To counter this, the Queen ordered festivals celebrating Amun-Ra and other deities, reviving traditions that reinforced the divine order and the legitimacy of the throne. Music, dance, and offerings filled the temples, drawing crowds who found solace and hope in the age-old customs. Throughout it all, Ankhesenamun found strength in her partnership with Horemheb. Their marriage, forged in the crucible of political necessity, had grown into a bond of respect and shared purpose. In private moments, they spoke candidly of fears and hopes, of the heavy burden of power and the fragile thread by which their reign hung. But even as they built a new Egypt, whispers of intrigue never ceased. Courtiers vied for favor, old alliances frayed, and the threat of assassination lingered like a dagger in the night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ankhesenamun received a visitor cloaked in shadow, a messenger bearing a sealed scroll. The message inside spoke of conspiracies against the throne, of plots involving nobles discontent with Horemheb's rise and the Queen's influence. The weight of the news settled on her chest like a stone. The path ahead was perilous, but she would not falter. For Egypt, for the memory of Tutankhamun, she would stand firm. The days that followed were marked by vigilance and careful maneuvering. Spies were uncovered, traitors punished, and alliances strengthened. The court became a chessboard, each move calculated, each piece vital. Amidst the turmoil, Ankhesenamun continued to nurture the people's hope. She sponsored schools for scribes, supported artisans reviving traditional crafts, and encouraged the collection of knowledge that had been threatened during the tumultuous years. In the quiet moments, she would visit the Valley of the Kings, standing before the sealed tomb of Tutankhamun. The golden mask stared back at her, serene and eternal. "Your dream lives on," she whispered. "Egypt will endure." And so, with unwavering determination and a heart both heavy and hopeful, Ankhesenamun and Horemheb led Egypt through a fragile renaissance, a kingdom reborn from the ashes of tragedy, yet forever marked by the shadows of its past. The great hall of the palace was alive with the flickering dance of torchlight, casting long shadows that stretched across the polished stone floor like fingers reaching into the future. Ankhesenamun sat upon the throne, her posture regal but tempered by the weight of countless sleepless nights. Beside her stood Horemheb, his gaze sharp and unwavering, a sentinel guarding the fragile peace they had fought so hard to establish. Outside, the city of Thebes throbbed with life, the sounds of merchants bartering, children laughing, and priests chanting prayers to the gods filled the air. Yet beneath the surface, the currents of unrest never fully stilled. The wounds inflicted by years of upheaval and religious strife still festered in the hearts of many. Ankhesenamun, once a sheltered princess and then a grieving widow, had transformed into a leader whose strength was measured not just by her titles, but by her resilience and empathy. She understood that Egypt's salvation would not come solely from swords and decrees, but from healing the fractured souls of its people. Horemheb, hardened by years on the battlefield and tempered by wisdom, governed with a firm hand. His reforms sought to restore order to the military, reassert the authority of the throne, and rebuild the institutions eroded during the years of instability. Together, they endeavored to revive the ancient traditions that had once unified the kingdom. The religious revival was central to their vision. Temples desecrated during Akhenaten's reign were painstakingly restored. Priests of Amun, once suppressed, returned to prominence, their rituals and hymns breathing new life into the spiritual fabric of the land. Festivals celebrating the gods became grand affairs, drawing crowds from every corner of Egypt to partake in the collective hope. Yet challenges remained. The Nile's unpredictable floods continued to threaten the land, and with them, the fragile economy. Famine and disease stalked the villages, breeding discontent and desperation. In the southern provinces, whispers of rebellion persisted, despite the queen and pharaoh's efforts at diplomacy. One morning, Ankhesenamun convened a council of advisors, generals and priests within the cool shadows of the palace. The air was thick with anticipation as she outlined her concerns. "The unity we seek is fragile," she began, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We must address not only the threats from without, but the divisions within. The people suffer, and if we do not act, we risk losing all that we have rebuilt." Horemheb nodded in agreement. "Our armies stand ready to defend Egypt, but force alone cannot secure lasting peace. We must win the hearts of our people." Plans were made to increase aid to famine-stricken regions, to support agricultural efforts with improved irrigation, and to promote trade by securing key routes. Ankhesenamun also emphasized education, commissioning scribes and scholars to preserve knowledge and teach the next generation. Meanwhile, the court's intrigues deepened. Nobles jockeyed for favor, and factions formed around different visions for Egypt's future. Isis loyalists, though diminished, still operated in the shadows, seeking opportunity to destabilize the throne. Ankhesenamun and Horemheb moved carefully through this labyrinth, balancing diplomacy with decisive action. Their alliance, once forged in necessity, had blossomed into a partnership of mutual respect and shared destiny. In quieter moments, the queen reflected on the path that had brought her here. The loss of Tutankhamun, the struggles for power, the hopes and fears of a nation reborn. Her prayers to Isis grew more fervent, seeking guidance and strength to carry the burdens she bore. As seasons passed, signs of renewal emerged. Harvests improved, temples flourished, and the people's faith was rekindled. Music and art returned to the courts and streets, celebrating both the gods and the resilience of Egypt's spirit. Yet the specter of the past remained. Tales of Tutankhamun's golden mask and untimely death were woven into the fabric of the kingdom's identity, a symbol of both tragedy and enduring legacy. Ankhesenamun often visited his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, standing in silent reverence before the golden visage that had become a beacon for the Egyptian soul. "Your dream lives on," she whispered, a promise carried on the desert winds. And so, the fragile peace endured, a testament to the strength of two rulers united by fate, and the hope that Egypt's greatest days still lay ahead. The heavy stones of the royal palace seemed to hum with memories, echoes of whispered plots, battles fought within gilded halls, and the relentless passage of time. Ankhesenamun stood by the large window of her private chamber, gazing out over the sprawling city of Thebes as twilight settled, painting the sky with bruised purples and fiery oranges. Below, the Nile's silvery ribbon wound through the land, lifeblood of a kingdom still struggling to reclaim its strength. Since the death of Tutankhamun, Egypt had been a land caught between hope and despair, between the promises of renewal and the shadows of a fractured past. The union between Ankhesenamun and Horemheb had stabilized the throne, but their rule was anything but secure. The court remained a minefield of intrigue and ambition, and beyond the city's walls, the edges of the empire trembled with unrest. Ankhesenamun's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Horemheb entered, his face etched with the weariness of a man who bore the burdens of kingship and war. "The northern provinces report new disturbances," he said quietly. "Rebels gather near the delta. They challenge our authority and threaten trade." She turned to him, the fire in her eyes steady and fierce. "Then we must remind them what it means to defy Egypt." Their plan was swift and decisive. Horemheb marshaled his forces, preparing for a campaign to quell the rebellion and restore order. But Ankhesenamun counseled caution. "Let us offer them terms," she said. "War will only bring suffering to our people." A delicate balance had to be maintained, between strength and mercy, between the will to rule and the need to unify. They sent emissaries, bearing gifts and promises, hoping to weave bonds where swords might only sever. At court, the tension was palpable. The priests of Amun, now powerful once more, eyed the queen with a mixture of reverence and suspicion. Some whispered that her influence threatened to overshadow the pharaoh. Nobles jockeyed for position, their smiles masking veiled threats. Among these was a figure from the past. Though exiled to the desert's edge, his name still stirred fear. Rumors persisted that his loyalists sought to undermine the throne, plotting in hidden corners. Ankhesenamun knew that the survival of her reign depended not only on political acumen, but on the loyalty of her people. She ventured often among them, listening to their fears and hopes. In the marketplaces, she spoke with merchants and farmers. In the temples, with priests and scribes. Her compassion became a bridge, a fragile thread connecting the crown to the hearts of Egypt's children. But the scars of the past were deep. The religious upheaval during Akhenaten's reign had left divisions that were slow to heal. Some worshipped the old gods with renewed fervor, others clung to memories of the monotheistic reforms. This spiritual tension simmered beneath the surface, threatening to boil over. In response, Ankhesenamun sponsored grand festivals celebrating the pantheon, music and dance filling the streets, offerings made to the gods with renewed devotion. These moments of shared joy helped knit together a people frayed by years of conflict. Yet the threats were never far. A messenger arrived one evening with troubling news. A spy network loyal to A had been uncovered, plotting assassination and rebellion. The court was shaken, and the queen moved swiftly to root out conspirators. The purge was brutal but necessary. Loyalties were tested, alliances reforged. Trust became a precious commodity. Through it all, Ankhesenamun and Horemheb remained united, a beacon of stability in uncertain times. Their partnership, forged in necessity, had blossomed into a true bond of leadership and respect. Still, Ankhesenamun often found herself retreating to the Valley of the Kings, standing silently before Tutankhamun's tomb. The golden mask, serene and eternal, reminded her of the boy king's dreams and the heavy price paid for them. "Egypt's fate is in our hands now," she whispered, tears tracing silent paths down her cheeks. The night was thick with stars, each one a distant witness to the enduring spirit of a land that had survived millennia of trials and triumphs. And so, the reign of Ankhesenamun and Horemheb marched forward, a story of resilience, hope, and the unyielding quest to restore Egypt's glory amid the shadows of its past. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a warm glow across the sprawling city of Thebes. The air was thick with the scent of lotus blossoms and the murmurs of early morning prayers echoing from the temples. Life moved steadily through the streets, a rhythm both ancient and fragile, reflecting the tenuous peace that held Egypt together after years of upheaval. Ankhesenamun stood on the balcony of the royal palace, her eyes tracing the familiar landscape, the winding Nile, the bustling markets, the distant pyramids standing like silent sentinels of time. Her hands rested lightly on the carved stone railing, the coolness grounding her as she pondered the weight of her crown. The years since Tutankhamun's death had been marked by relentless struggle, yet also moments of hope. Together with Horemheb, she had navigated the treacherous waters of politics, rebellion, and restoration. Their reign was a delicate dance, balancing the needs of the gods and the people, the ambitions of the nobles, and the desires of the common folk. Today, however, brought new challenges. A messenger approached swiftly, bowing low as he handed her a sealed scroll. Breaking the wax with practiced fingers, Ankhesenamun's eyes scanned the message. It spoke of unrest in the western desert regions, where nomadic tribes defied Egyptian authority, threatening trade routes and settlements. Horemheb joined her, his expression grave. The desert is vast and unforgiving. These tribes have long resisted our rule. She nodded. We must act wisely. A campaign of force could ignite a war we cannot afford. Perhaps there is another way. Their council convened within the cool shadows of the palace chambers. Generals spoke of military action. Priests urged divine favor. Advisors debated the best course. Ankhesenamun listened, weighing each voice against the wisdom of her heart. Finally, she spoke. We will send envoys bearing gifts and words of peace. We will offer protection and trade, but we will stand ready to defend our land. The plan was set in motion. Meanwhile, life within Thebes flourished. Markets buzzed with activity, artisans crafted treasures worthy of the gods, and scholars preserved knowledge on papyrus scrolls. The queen took particular interest in the schools, sponsoring education for scribes and priests alike, believing that wisdom was the foundation of Egypt's future. Yet, even as progress marched forward, shadows lingered. Rumors of dissent circulated, whispers of factions dissatisfied with Horemheb's reforms, nobles chafing under tightened control, priests debating the true path of faith. The scars of the past, though healed on the surface, ran deep beneath. Ankhesenamun found solace in moments of quiet reflection, often retreating to the gardens where the fragrance of jasmine and myrrh calmed her restless spirit. There, she thought of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose brief life had ignited a flame she now bore. One evening, as stars began to pierce the velvet sky, a messenger arrived with news that would test their reign. A band of rebels emboldened by unrest had attacked a caravan near the western border. The loss of life and goods was a blow to Egypt's fragile economy and a challenge to the queen's authority. Horemheb's jaw tightened. We cannot allow such defiance to go unanswered. Ankhesenamun agreed, but insisted on restraint. We must show strength, yes, but also mercy. Let us seek to understand the rebels' grievances. Envoys were dispatched once more, this time carrying both warning and offers of dialogue. The queen herself prepared to journey to the troubled region, a bold move signaling her commitment to peace. The journey was arduous, the desert sun unforgiving, but Ankhesenamun's resolve never wavered. Along the way, she witnessed the hardships faced by those living on the empire's edges, the scarcity of water, the encroaching sands, the fragile hopes clinging to survival. Meeting with tribal leaders, she spoke not as a distant ruler, but as a woman seeking common ground. Her words, tempered with empathy and authority, opened doors previously closed by suspicion and fear. Slowly, a fragile truce took shape. Returning to Thebes, Ankhesenamun found the city abuzz with news of her journey. The people saw in her a queen who cared beyond palace walls, whose vision embraced all of Egypt's diverse peoples. Yet, even as peace blossomed, the court remained a cauldron of tension. A's old loyalists continued to plot, seeking opportunities to undermine the throne. Spies lurked in shadowed corners, and alliances shifted like desert sands. In this environment, Ankhesenamun and Horemheb's partnership was both shield and sword. Their trust in one another, a bulwark against the storms threatening to engulf them. The queen often found herself pondering the nature of power, the delicate balance between mercy and strength, tradition and change. Egypt's future depended on her choices, on her ability to navigate the intricate web of politics, faith, and culture. As the season turned and the Nile swelled with the annual flood, hope returned to the fields and the hearts of the people. The temples rang with hymns of praise, and the golden mask of Tutankhamun remained a silent guardian of a kingdom reborn. Ankhesenamun knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was determined to lead with courage and compassion, honoring the memory of the boy king, whose spirit still guided her every step. The twilight hour settled gently over Thebes, the city's golden hues fading into deep indigos and purples as the desert stars blinked awake. From the highest terrace of the royal palace, Ankhesenamun gazed out across the sprawling kingdom, the endless stretch of the Nile weaving through fertile fields and arid desert, the temples rising like monuments to eternity, and the distant silhouettes of pyramids standing steadfast against the horizon. It was a land, both ancient and ever-changing, caught between the weight of its storied past and the fragile hope of a new dawn. Her journey had been anything but easy. From the tender age when she was bound by duty to a throne shadowed by tragedy, through the loss of Tutankhamun, the boy king whose brief flicker of life had ignited both hope and despair. She had risen. She had transformed from a grieving widow to a queen of unmatched resolve, a woman who bore the heavy mantle of leadership with grace and strength. Beside her, Horemheb, the warrior who had taken up the crown and shielded the kingdom with iron will, had been both partner and pillar, their fates entwined like the lotus and papyrus of the Nile. Together, they had walked a narrow path between war and peace, tradition and change, ambition and sacrifice. The years of their reign had been marked by tireless efforts to heal a kingdom fractured by upheaval, the religious turmoil left in Akhenaten's wake, the unrest of distant provinces, the shadows of political intrigue and betrayal within the palace walls. Yet, in spite of all these trials, Egypt endured. The temples they restored breathed once again with the voices of priests, chanting hymns to Amun-Ra and the pantheon of gods who had watched over the land for millennia. Festivals flourished, drawing peasants and nobles alike into joyous celebrations of life, death, and rebirth. The scribes chronicled these days with ink and papyrus, preserving a legacy of resilience for generations yet unborn. But the future remained a fragile thread, tenuous and unspooling in the hands of fate. Reports continued to arrive of skirmishes along the borders, the restless nomads of the desert, the encroaching powers to the north, and even whispers of discontent within the court itself. Though the queen and pharaoh ruled with wisdom and strength, the ancient gods demanded vigilance, and the land remained a battleground of both mortal and divine wills. Ankhesenamun closed her eyes, feeling the cool desert breeze brush across her face. She thought of Tutankhamun, the child whose golden mask lay entombed deep within the Valley of the Kings, a silent guardian of a dynasty's hopes and failures. His death had been a wound that never fully healed, but his memory lived on in every act of courage and compassion she and Horemheb had dared to undertake. She whispered a prayer to Isis, the goddess who had cradled her in times of sorrow and guided her through the darkest nights. "Protect Egypt and all who call her home," she beseeched softly. "Grant us strength to endure and wisdom to lead." Behind her, footsteps echoed softly. Horemheb stepped forward, his gaze steady and reassuring. "The people look to you, Ankhesenamun, to your courage and your heart." She smiled faintly, turning to face him. "We have done what we can, but the river flows onward, ever changing. So must we." Together they stood in silence, the weight of their shared burdens balanced by the unspoken promise of their partnership. The land below pulsed with life, a living tapestry of countless souls whose fates were intertwined with theirs. As night deepened, the palace stirred with whispers of diplomacy and dissent, of hope and hidden threats. But for a moment, amid the stars and silence, the future seemed bright, an unbroken thread of possibility stretching beyond the horizon. The story of Ankhesenamun and Horemheb was not just a tale of kings and queens, but of a nation's unyielding spirit, a testament to the enduring power of faith, love, and resilience. Egypt's saga would continue, shaped forever by those who dared to dream amid the shadows, who fought with honor in the face of despair, and who carried the light of the gods within their hearts. And so, as the dawn approached and the Nile glistened beneath the moon's pale glow, a new chapter awaited, one written by the countless hands and hearts of a people who had survived the storms of history and would thrive for all time.